Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the TinHifi T3 Plus. So the T3 Plus is the latest in the T series, and it does feature a 10mm LCP dynamic driver. So this one is definitely pitched towards you single dynamic driver folks, and there are plenty of you out there who appreciate the almost perfect coherency of a high quality single dynamic driver. So first, before we begin, I do want to thank Keep Hi-Fi for sending this one to me as a review sample. You can find it today on their website for $69, and there'll be a link down below. So, I have to admit it is a very nice looking shell design. Not that much of a radical design, but just a very high quality, build quality for $69. Very much dig it. And you can kind of see that high quality LCP driver right there. Nozzle is definitely not super thin, not too short. It's kind of a nice size, and a really nice faceplate with the TinHifi logo as well. Cable is it's okay. It's kind of a black twisted cable with some nice silver titanium gray hardware. So not a bad set at all for $69, and it does come with this nice pouch as well. And the case itself is underneath that, and it is quite nice as well. So let's kind of jump into it, and kind of right off the bat, the T3 has been talked about quite a bit since its introduction. Quite a lot of hype around it. So, I think everyone knows it is a very solid DD set. Very nice for the price. We'll get to the graph in a second, but it does have a very nice tuning, and you get that DD coherency, which fans of single DDs are very much appreciative of. And I will call it a safe tuning, but when you look at the whole package, it's not exactly special. It's very hard to point towards one specific thing that I really love on the T3 versus other single dynamic drivers. So I will say it's safe and likable, but not necessarily special. So let's kind of jump into the graphs real quick, and you get almost, pick up everything you need to know from the graphs on the T3. It's pretty obvious what's going on. So right off the bat, people love this graph. When it was first posted, it's got this really nice, gentle, just have a little mid-bass energy right here, but very little, not enough to really affect the mids. There's not much bleed at all. So drop down into the mids, and then you do kind of a nice horizontal sweep through the mids. It's kind of a very shallow V-shaped looking graph, and then do another gentle rise and get plenty of extension out here. So just looking at the graph, there weren't any really wacky peaks that people were annoyed at. There wasn't too much bass, it wasn't too much or too little bass if you're just looking at it. Not the least mid bass bump I've ever seen. It could have dropped down to the Harman target. So there is a little energy there in the mid bass just to give it a little punch. So I think people looked at the graph and said, oh, pretty nice tuning. This one, it's definitely going to be a solid $70 without any major flaws. And I think that's the gist of what it is. So what does it sound like? What does it closely resemble? So think about your BL03, that very thick mids, heavy bass, lots of energy being carried into your mids, lots of bleed, lots of maybe congestion, cloudiness, all those things that people attributed to as faults on the BL03. So when you look at the T3 Plus, you can see they really try to address those similar things. So you almost have the same curve going into the mids, but at a much reduced level. So not nearly as much sub bass, especially the mid bass also as well drop quite a bit, and a much cleaner entrance into your mid. So not nearly as much bleed as you get in the BL03, but you still have that richness that you get with a dynamic driver. And the mids, kind of similar. They're just a lot leaner than the BL03. And then coming through here, you'll see that T3 really tried to address the especially the lower treble being a little light on the BL03, so bump that up here, and then have more extension than the O3, which is always a good thing. People like to hear all the treble, so yeah, definitely give the people a BL03 experience, much cleaner in the bass, the mids much leaner, and then a treble that is more extended and bumped up a little bit. So if you're a Blonde fan, you'll sort of recognize the T3, what it's trying to do as what BL01 did. So again, we'll take a final look at the graphs and say, so T3 Plus, again, this very lighter bass level, so not a big bloated bass at all compared to BL03. The nice sweep into the mids again. So looking at the BL01, where it actually traced and added a little mid bass to BL03 into the mids, but then BL01 actually bumped up into the lower treble, even above where T3 Plus is. So just to give you an idea of where it is, it is kind of between BL03 and BL01 for those of you who have both of those. And you can kind of see the treble follows kind of a similar path. It kind of sticks to this middle ground, and then on the extension, it looks almost like BL01 as well. So, for a trio of dynamic drivers, you can kind of see T3 is going to have the cleanest lower section. The mid section, that is going to be a personal preference. You're either going to like the leanness of T3 or wish you had a thicker, richer version of BL03 or even 01. And then treble, you're probably going to appreciate the higher level of T3 and the extension of T3 as well. So good job there. That'll, hit some people's preferences. Other people, not as much. But that's the gist of the idea of how T3 is a little different than maybe a more budget style BL01. So, like I said, the sound leans towards upper mid bright. So this, especially this whole area right here, it's a little bright without a doubt compared to especially the bass level. So BL01 was actually a little brighter, so I think people didn't necessarily like it there as well. So T1 brought it down a little bit, but when you think about the balance here, this lower treble part is emphasized just a little bit more. So I will say it leans upper mid bright, but can sound like a leaner, brighter BL03, especially with the right music. It's kind of in that ballpark, just quite a bit leaner and cleaner than the BL03, and you get the better extension, as I mentioned. But I think both of them are very likable as well. So bass, like I said, not a. Let me see if I can pull it back up. So especially compared to 03, when you think about 03 level of bass and then dropping it down a good 5 decibels, the extension on the bass into the sub bass rolls off a little bit. There is some rumble there, but you got to kind of struggle to hear it. And then it's got this very gentle, you can call that a very shallow V shape. There is a boost to it, but it's not a whole lot. It's kind of in between that shallow V and neutral as well on the bass side. So I'll call it neutralish, not very deep on drums. So if you're expecting that, when you hear the drums hit and then that rumble follow through, not so much on this set. It's got more of a tight, faster, kind of a soft, punchy, but a little bit too fast for texture. It definitely leans towards that quick and fast bass as opposed to something like the BL3, which was a much slower, richer experience, a more rumbly experience. This one is definitely tighter and faster. And, on the bad side of that, something like a track like Smells Like Teen Spirit, it just leaves you a bit unsatisfying on the drums. Tidal wave sub-focused, something more electronic oriented, kind of the same thing. It just sounds a little bit unsatisfying, a little bit hollow, because it doesn't really have that sub bass body that you expect to hear, especially on a dynamic driver, backing up the mid bass. So you could probably change tips, and if you really want more bass body, I would highly suggest changing tips to something that gives you more of that sub bass-ish emphasis. But tuning wise, that's not what this one was really designed for. It's a lighter, faster, quicker bass experience. So the mids, as I was talking about, quite clean. There's not a whole lot of bleed at all in from your bass. Not too lean, not overly bloated and thick like a BL3, nowhere near that. But, this kind of comes down to, are you a DD person or a hybrid person? How you interpret the resolution and detail. So lots of people say it sounds pretty good for $70. If you're a hybrid person, it's barely average detail and resolution in the mids. And I will have to admit, it's the hardest part about this set for me, is it's just missing a bunch of texture and detail in the mids, and vocals kind of sound okay, but they really don't sound like $70. They just sound okay. And then you end up with something that sounds a bit fast. There's not a whole lot of reverberation. A lot of that feels a little bit truncated. Sounds better on faster tracks and edgy instruments. But I just had a really hard time enjoying vocals on this one. And I had to kind of go back to tracks that sound typically very good on almost any budget set. I can see clearly now, Holly Cole Trio, her voice is just thick and rich and beautiful. And on here, just a bit too clean. There's not a whole lot of texture. It's kind of smooth over and unengaging. So, yeah, I think, when you really think about what they did, so why do people like BL03 versus something a little leaner? So resolution-wise, they probably are about the same, but where BL03 gives you a thicker, richer, more natural experience, T3 Plus really leans that out and exposes it. And if you're going to expose the vocals and make them as transparent and a whole lot of clarity, they better be right on. There better be a whole lot of detail there. So what they really did was expose the whole midsection, and the midsection didn't really have the resolution that people may be expecting at $70. So they probably did the right thing, but the driver didn't necessarily jive with what they were doing. So tuning wise, yeah, I think it was okay. Did the driver perform as expected? And for my expectations, not so much. And for me, it just kind of kills the mids in that little area. So on the other hand, treble, it has that extension that we talked about. Great level, great presence, not fatiguing, it's quite safe. Not a ton of detail, kind of like the mids. And then again, your emphasis especially is in these female vocals, the gain area. That's where most of your emphasis is. And you'll hear it in female vocals. There are definitely more forward instruments in the section. Everything is more forward compared to anything back here. So not that unique to have an emphasis right there, but that's pretty much where it is. But out of the three bits here, I think the treble is probably my favorite of how they executed on it compared to the other two. But if you can't do vocals at $70, I think that's an issue. So stage, kind of the same thing. It's okay for the price. It's between the ears. It never really sounds all that spacious. And most of the time it just sounds like a room with a low ceiling. There isn't a ton of height to it. There's just a little bit. So combining this with this, the two kind of don't really work for me. So solid DD. I got no issues with that. It definitely gives you a likable tuning. But when you get down into the details of how they executed it and how it does to other single DDs, I think this one's not too special for me. So that's about it. Thank you again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.